Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today we're joined by a very special guest who is a part of Jude 3, Dr. Vince Bantu. He's been on several times. He's no stranger. Welcome back, Dr. Bantu.
Hey, Lisa. Good to see you again. Good to be back.
Good to have you back on the podcast. So today we're going to talk about something that you're experiencing in real time now, which is what's going on in St. Louis. For those who haven't been watching the news or who don't know, or who may have saw something on social media but don't really know what's going on, why are there protests right now in St. Louis?
Yeah. So, just for those that maybe haven't heard the details, so there was an incident that happened in 2011 where a St. Louis police officer named Jason Stockley was killed. A young African American man, Anthony Lamar Smith, in 2011. They were involved in a high-speed chase. Anthony Lamar Smith was apparently involved in drugs, and there's a video. You can see the full video of all the everything from the police dash cam, but he had started to drive away and was trying to get away, evade resisting arrest or evading arrest, and so they chased him for a couple of minutes and ended up crashing into Mr. Smith's car. And then Officer Stockley, a white police officer, then got out of the car. Him and his partner got out of the car and approached the driver's side, and then he shot him 5 times, killing Anthony Lamar Smith in the car. And this was 6 years ago, and so the trial's been going on, and the verdict was just released on Friday, so just 5 days ago, that the judge had found Officer Stockley not guilty of first-degree murder. And so this was extremely upsetting, not only to people in the Black community, but people across the city and across the country to whom it seemed pretty clear that Officer Stockley had intended to and did murder Anthony Lamar Smith, that this wasn't self-defense as he claimed it was and his attorney claimed it was. And there's lots of evidence that have led a lot of people and just kind of circumstances and what happened and transpired that led people to see it as murder, and that Officer Stockley is guilty of murder. Number one, probably the most kind of damning and just even like just really disturbing aspect of it was the fact that during the police chase, Officer Stockley was recorded as saying, "We're going to kill this mother effer, don't you know it?" And that is clear that he said that. He doesn't deny saying it. He says he doesn't remember saying it. And the judge who acquitted him of murder, Pat, wrote it off as saying, "Well, we all say things in the heat of the moment." However, even the judge's kind of dismissal of that statement is proven to be very unsatisfactory, even to people in law enforcement and in the justice system, of course, and of course, let alone in the Black community and the community at large. Because while we all say some things in the heat of the moment, Officer Stockley actually did end up killing this person, who had not attacked them. He was resisting arrest and fleeing the scene, but then also the fact that Officer Stockley claims that Anthony Lamar Smith had a gun and that he was pulling it and going to fire at him, and that's why it was self-defense. The problem with that is that the DNA tests show that that Anthony Lamar Smith's DNA was not on the gun, and that Officer Stockley's DNA was on the gun. Also, the fact that Officer Stockley took off his gloves when he was after killing Anthony Lamar Smith, and then began to just go about the scene. He took off his gloves, which was not part of police procedure, but it also gave him an excuse as to why his DNA was on the gun. According to his story, after having lifted the gun and started to search the scene. But that's not normal procedure, from what I understand, to be removing your gloves in a situation like that. Also, and many other police officers have said this as well, it seems very strange that Officer Stockley, after killing Anthony Lamar Smith, made several trips back and forth between Smith's car and his own police vehicle as well. And it just makes it seem very likely and very clear that he had planted that gun in his car. And it's not normal procedure after killing a suspect to be making so many trips back and forth between your vehicle. that even Officer Stockley's partner Bianchi, did not, he did not testify to seeing any gun that Smith had. Also, the video shows that Officer Bianchi did not have his weapon out, but it was holstered, which would not lend to the idea that Smith had a gun and that he was drawing it on him. And so, just with all of these different things, it seems really clear that Officer Stockley did intend to and did murder Anthony Lamar Smith. And again, even police officers in different groups like the Ethical Society of Police in St. Louis have said that even they support a guilty verdict for murder for Jason Stockley. Even our mayor, Lyda Crewson in St. Louis, has said that she was disappointed at the verdict. It just seems clear to people at all levels of society that this was a clear case of murder, and yet he was let go. And so it's just yet another example of, unfortunately, just a long list over the last few years of cases that have really come to light. And that's not to say anything about the countless number of cases of police brutality and murder that are happening across the country that don't get news, released or don't make the big news. But because because again of such the clear cut nature of it and the fact that he was let go, many protesters had come, have been coming out in full force ever since then. Friday afternoon is when it really popped off, when they released the verdict Friday morning, and immediately people were on the scene downtown St. Louis, and they were protesting, and then some of the protesters began to block the police in their getting onto the buses that were bringing them in, and so that's when the police deployed tear gas as well as mace. And I was present for that protest, and I witnessed people being maced in the face, and I saw police officers telling people to move and disperse, and then like about 1 second or 2 seconds maximum after telling them to disperse, spraying them in the face with mace and not really actually giving them a chance to disperse. And so that protest ended pretty quickly, and then we had a very large one in the Central West End neighborhood of St. Louis, which is like kind of the most like posh, wealthy neighborhood of St. Louis, and we did a protest, and that was definitely the largest one. There was over 1,000 people who had come into that protest, and it was a peaceful protest. There was, unfortunately, there were a few zealots in the crowd who did end up throwing some bricks at the mayor's house, and also at a couple of businesses, broke a couple of windows, but nobody was attacked. There was no looting going on. There were a couple of windows broken, but nothing was stolen, or there. Again, it was 1,000 people, and just from me being in the midst of that crowd looking out, it was first of all, it was a mixture of people. I mean, I saw like Arabs, I saw Indians, I saw Hispanic people, there were more white people than anybody. There were a lot of white people. I saw Jewish rabbis, I saw college professors that I know personally in the crowd, many college students. College students might be even the largest demographic in the protesting crowd. Many African Americans of different social classes, clergy. It was a very mixed crowd of people, and they were peaceful. And it was a good event to raise awareness. But then after the march had ended on Friday night, then there was that was when police really started to get more aggressive. Was when the mass numbers had really fizzled out, and the protest just ended on its own, peacefully, and decided to end by itself. But then when there was a few stragglers left kind of still in the streets talking, then the police started getting very aggressive, and then started tear gassing people at that point, and then there were several arrests made. So that stuff has been going on ever since. And on Saturday, there was another protest in another kind of trendy area called the Del Mar Loop, which is actually around the corner from my house. And there was a few windows broken in that protest, and there was again, kind of harsh tactics deployed. And then there was artists that came out and fixed up the broken windows and painted them like almost immediate turnaround. And then there's on Sunday there was a protest downtown that again became violent. And then I was able to participate in that as well. And even after again, even after the majority of the protests had dispersed, there were only a few stragglers left. And I remember being downtown and actually seeing, and actually for anybody that sees my Facebook, I posted a picture of this. I remember seeing lines of police officers. I mean, literally like kind of marching in like this propagandist and like intentionally intimidating form, where I saw, like dozens and dozens of police on one street marching down, and then on other streets, and they were closing people in on all sides. And we're not allowing some people to leave who were just around. There's a lot of homeless people in that area downtown that are on the streets. There were people just hanging out, going out to eat, and there were still protesters lingering. And the police were banging their clubs and marching in unison and yelling. And they were even doing a mock of like saying, "Whose streets? Our streets." And many of them were like cursing and yelling loud, and it was just very clear that they were trying to intimidate. And it felt like a police state. It felt like a military state downtown. And I saw many people that were in pairs, or just like kind of people walking by themselves, who were like quickly running away from the police in fear. And it was a very disturbing sight. And then, Monday night, I was able to participate again in a demonstration that was outside of the Justice Center, which is, kind of right in our downtown courtroom area, kind of the legal center of town. And again, there was a peaceful protest that happened there with several hundred protesters. And then yesterday, Tuesday, we had I wasn't able to participate in this. I was doing things with my family yesterday, but there was an all city interfaith prayer service right downtown, kind of right in the heart of downtown, with I think the Archbishop of St. Louis was the person who really convened that. And then, but there were Jewish and African-American clergy and just, clergy from all different denominations had joined together for a joint prayer service. And then there's been meetings. I went to one Monday, and I'm going to another one on tomorrow morning, actually, of different pastors and leaders who are getting together and just trying to think about how can we solve these issues? What can we do to respond and really make a difference? So basically, it's been a very tense last 5 days in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for being out there and representing just the church, because I think a lot of people make statements that pastors and leaders aren't at the forefront of this fight, and people like yourself actually show that that's not true. There are clergy, there are people who are being prophetic voices in these situations, and I think that's something that needs to be highlighted. For those who have watched this, and I know there's a lot of tension between sometimes Black Lives Matter and churches, what would you say to them? Because I think there's a need for us to work together in works like this. How would you advise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it really, like, I think that it's very complex, and I think there's a lot of different valid points on different sides, because I do think that there is a tension, and I do think that there is kind of a chasm specifically between the Black church and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that it's really appropriate, especially at Jude 3, to be having that conversation, because one thing that you've led us in, Lisa, in this community of Jude 3, is addressing issues that are most pertinent to the Black church and to the African American Christian experience. And I think that given our day, where, especially right now, this last week, and in general, last few years, that this movement has really taken place. But then, as we've seen, as that movement has come out, that there's a big tension between the Black church, and there's a lot of disconnect between the Black church and this new movement, that I think is really timely to have that conversation and to be asking that question, which, I think is really complex, but as a way of like kind of synthesizing all the complexity of it. When I enter into this issue as a pastor, as a seminary professor, as a scholar, but then also as a still relatively young Black man, I'm starting to get a lot of grades now, but I'm still pretty young, and have been and am still sometimes the victim of police discrimination myself. I feel like in some ways floating between these different worlds, and I see a lot of valid points on both sides. But again, kind of the way I enter into it, and from my own thinking, bring all the different factors together, is I think about the relationship between the Black Lives Matter and the Black church almost through the analogy of a parent-child relationship. That I see the relationship and the dynamic in many ways as analogous to parents and children, specifically where there's been some distrust and some hurt and some neglect and some abuse on both sides of that parent-child relationship, where that relationship has become strained, and now the relation is disparate. Because when we look at it, if we're just being honest, I think, and I'm saying this as an African American pastor, that in many ways the Black church is not reaching our young people, as well as we could. And in many ways, the Black church is kind of an institution that is predominantly for people that are middle-aged or older. And of course, we have children, but really the young demographic, kind of 18 to 35, that's the demographic that oftentimes we're lacking the most, especially when you come into the inner city, especially when you come into the context of poverty. In my community in North St. Louis, you go to most Black churches, and that age bracket is exactly the age bracket that is most lacking in almost like any Black church, is 18 to 35 from the community. That, you'll have little kids, you'll have middle age, you have older people. And, but what is it that we're doing wrong? What is it that we're lacking, that once those children reach, adulthood, and we're not the ones bringing them to church anymore, losing them, right? And so I think that there is a lot of ways in which, we haven't connected with our youth in ways that we should. And so this movement, this Black Lives Matter movement, is really predominantly being led by that very age bracket. The very age bracket that we are lacking in the church are the ones who are out here on the street marching. And it's mostly young Black urban adults, late teens, 20s. That's the majority of the people. And it's just interesting to see here on the ground, to see hundreds and hundreds of people, white, Asian, Hispanic, Black clergy, but all following young Black people. They were clearly the ones who were at the helm of it. The people with the bullhorns and the people with the mics, the people leading the chants, were young urban African Americans who looked like they were like 19, 20, 21 years old. And so there's just so much complexity, because now these young people, many of them are thinking, well, I don't need to go to church. I have a church right here. I got hundreds of people who are following me. And honestly, I'm concerned about a lot of these young people, because, now they're on CNN, and they're being traveled brought around the country, like after Ferguson happened. And ever since then, they're being brought around the country as these leaders, all of these different sub-organizations that are all part of this overall movement. Black Lives Matter. I mean, because it really is just a movement. It's not like there's an organization with like a president and a board of trustees, and like people talk about Black Lives Matter like it's a concrete thing, but it's more of a movement. And there's all these different organizations, but there are some commonalities to it. And even the young activists here in St. Louis that I know that they're not going to church. I know they don't want to go to church. And I also know that most of them are living a very worldly lifestyle, and many of them are very much lost. But also, knowing their stories, I know most of them are in broken homes, and most of them are in non-Christian homes where they have, maybe one parent, maybe that parent is on drugs, maybe they, just live a very worldly lifestyle. So they're not, so again, when I look at these people, I don't see them as primarily people to criticize, but more so I see them as lost children that need our guidance and need us to come alongside them. Because that's another reason why a lot of Black churches are not getting involved in these protests, because they're saying, again, a valid critique of saying, well, there's no practical goals, there's no practical steps. I mean, what petition should I sign? Where are we going to boycott? How are we going to strategically shift our Black dollars to make an economic difference in the community? I mean, there was, again, another event. There was a mall that got shut down this weekend out in the suburbs of St. Louis, which, but I mean, for the most part, there has not been as much of like kind of a thought through strategic plan. And I get that. I understand that. But again, it's 19 and 21-year-olds that are leading the thing. What do you expect them to be able to do? And so the very fact that there isn't as much organization and planning to it as maybe we might want or be used to is the very reason as to why we need to be coming alongside and supporting them and giving them our strategic thinking and strategic planning skills that often they don't have. But that to me is just yet another example of how we're not coming alongside. In a way, we're kind of neglecting our children, and we and then they're kind of left to their own devices to figure it out for themselves, which is in many ways where our youth are at in general. As a whole, that many times are left to just figure things out to themselves. A lot of these people in the street, these young people who are doing stuff, as a pastor, any young person in the street that's involved in drugs, violence, all that kind of stuff, they do not have a family support structure, and they're the church is not a place where they want to go, where I have to dress a certain way, where I have to talk a certain way, where I have to change every single thing about myself to fit in this place. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of things our young people need to change. There's a lot of things that a lot of these young adults are doing that need to come out of a worldly lifestyle. But I mean, just as an example, I was just at a gathering with Black pastors in the city, and we were planning a joint youth event, and the whole goal was to reach youth. And first of all, I didn't even want to get into, because I didn't want to get jeered as much as I already did. But I'm like, why are we all? I was the youngest person there. Why are we all a bunch of middle-aged people sitting around talking about how to reach youth? Let's bring some youth leaders into this. But then I made a suggestion. Like, I knew a Christian rapper, and I said, how about we bring this Christian rapper to the event? And like, you should have seen the way everybody looked at me like I was crazy. And I'm just like, really? Like, that's the attitude we have? Like, you're like, oh no, we don't do that hip hop stuff. And I'm like, that's, I mean, that's just one of many examples to why we're not connecting with our youth, and it's on us to do it. And I mean, again, speaking of Christian hip hop, any Christian rapper will tell you that they get more support from white churches and white Christian, patrons and purchasers and consumers than they do from the Black church. And so again, we have this, and I mean, even here in St. Louis, like I know so many young, innovative young Black pastors who are starting churches, and that actually are reaching young people. And there's a good handful of them that are reaching that very demographic that many of the churches are lacking. I know Black churches that are, almost the whole church is people in their 20s. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like, that's what we want to see. People, young people in our community lifting up holy hands to Jesus. But again, they're doing things strategically to reach them. They preach in jeans and a t-shirt, and they might use some ebonics when they're preaching, and they don't care if a young person comes in with their hat on, as long as they're, as long as what's on the inside is being transformed and they're seeking Jesus, right? It's just in so many ways contextualized, and getting involved in these kind of protests and speaking to the valid anger that a lot of these young people feel. But a lot of these pastors, I mean, these are biblical, some of which even seminary trained pastors who are reaching, these are like pastors in their 30s, reaching people in their 20s. And a lot of them came up or associate pastors in more established Black churches. And then when they felt called to plant a church to really reach youth, they get no support from established Black churches with hundreds of thousands of dollar budgets, and pastors with jets and cars and all this kind of stuff, and are not getting. They get more support from white denominations and white churches than a lot of established Black churches who kind of come up under their ministry, kind of, be their son in the ministry and stay in their house. But I mean, the fact that church planting and supporting church planting is really largely not a part of the Black church culture, that's a problem. And we have to be supporting these ministers and these people that are really trying to reach the youth and are really connected to, by their own age, connected to the youth. And so again, like, I see so many problems with the Black Lives Matter movement. I get out and march with them as a way of showing them that I am here for you. And when I'm out in the streets, I'm chanting along with them. When they go to the F the police thing, or then I'm like, all right, well, I ain't gonna say that. I'm quiet now, right? I can't get down with that. But when they say things, I'm saying Black Lives Matter with them. And I'm saying, like, we have to end racism in the police force. I'm trying to be out there with them. I'm going to say it with them. And not just be there kind of observing. I did see some clergy come out, but I noticed that a lot of them weren't chanting with them. Even some of the chants that we should be able to say, racism has got to go in the police force, right? But it's almost like, and I can tell that some of them, even that are trying to get into it, are kind of almost like tipping up to the water and dipping their toe in, but I want to be, I want to be there not only to hand out bottles of water and pray for people, but I want to chant with them. But I also want to, and I have been in the streets talking to young people, and I'm hearing their just visceral anger at the church, and when they hear I'm a pastor, and other clergy that have been involved in this get the same thing. And that's the other thing about it too, is that most of the clergy that are involved in it are very liberal, right? They're people from really liberal denominations that do care about justice, right? But that's that same divide between Christian liberalism and biblical orthodoxy. That again, a lot of the churches and pastors that are really strong on biblical authority and kind of biblical orthodoxy are very slow to get involved in protesting and calling for justice, right? And even sometimes even some of the good excuses are like, well, but we need to create solutions. I'm like, yes, that's very true, we do. But we also do need to raise up our voice. There is a role for the prophet in the New Testament. Like there's a biblical role of prophecy in saying there is systemic racism and sin in our police force, in our judicial system that needs to just be called out. And we need to be alongside our young people, linking arms with them, saying it with them, so we can show them that the church is here with you. The church is here for you. Right, and not just the liberal church that's trying to pimp them and kind of bring them into their theology by saying, "Oh yeah, we care about you. We're concerned for Black lives." But then they'll sometimes feel more support from a liberal church that doesn't even stand on the authority of Scripture and the authority of the Word than a church that does. Right, but we've had this pacified Jesus and this pacified theology that says, "Well, our response is we're going to hold a prayer meeting. Our response is we're going to hold a joint prayer service." Right, and even the language of it, right? We want peace, right? And then whereas Black Lives Matter, we're saying we want justice, no peace, right? That's what they're chanting. And it's like we have to understand the biblical concept of shalom. That shalom, which means peace, also means wholeness. It means justice. It means things being set right. And so it's not enough for us to only, yes, we need to pray. Amen. We need to get together and pray and have prayer services. But then we need to pray with our feet and call for systemic change and get involved and come together with our youth and not just have pastor meetings where we get together and talk about it. And then over here, stand hands up, don't shoot, or Black Lives Matter, or whoever else are having their meetings. But let's come together and let's have meetings together. And let's, really, I think we have examples and models of that even in the civil rights movement and Dr. King. It's really kind of eerie the way in which the dynamic between the Black church and Black Lives Matter is so similar to the dynamic that Dr. King encountered 50 years ago, right? Because when Dr. King came to Chicago and wanted to get involved in movements there, that was when he really was rocked and encountered a different dynamic that he had ever encountered before. And he describes it in his autobiography where in the South, he was leading protests, leading marches, but he said that the Black inner cities of the North had such a different dynamic that it was so different that there was much more kind of urban slum conditions where Blacks who moved up in the migration had been boxed into these metropolitan cities in New York and Pittsburgh and Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago, and in many ways the anger was so much more real there. And this is where a lot of the Black nationalist movements really were taking off. And so there was much more of an attitude of, no, we're not going to just be nice and pray and this and that. No, we're going to call for change. So when he came up there, that was the first time he had ever been booed, right? By Blacks. They were like, they didn't want to hear all this stuff about integration and we need to love our neighbor. They're saying we need to raise up our voices. And so, but instead of just being defensive of the Black church or being kind of dismissing these young people, Dr. King worked with them and he called meetings with gang leaders in Chicago. And he gave them leadership positions in the movement. And then when they were marching, he gave them roles in the march to be like leading and guiding the marches, right? And he was working with them. And so, I think that's really like the model that we have to continue to work into, because I think that in many ways, as a community, I think we have some hurdles that Dr. King didn't have necessarily, because in many ways, Dr. King and the Black community and the Black church in the 60s was so much more integrated, was so much more, Blacks lived in the communities where the churches were at, right? And the community was whole. There were more fathers in the house. The community was just more cohesive. Now, not only have we had 50 years later, not only have we had white flight, but we've had Black flight too, Black middle class flight. But yet, Blacks still have their churches in our community. So, right here in St. Louis in the North Side, church in this community, the pastors, the elders, the leaders, the majority of the members do not live in this community, but they come in on Sunday and then they kind of act like they own the place. Like they got their stop sign put up in the middle of the street. They got their crossing guard with his yellow vest, like stopping traffic like he's a cop, and they got the streets all narrowed out because there's people double parking in the middle of the street, and then in their fancy cars. Then they all go back to North County, St. Louis at 12 o'clock, and then from 12 o'clock Sunday afternoon until 9 o'clock the next Sunday, the neighborhood is the same, and the people who actually live in the community, most of them are not going to that church. And so in many ways we have this class divide between the black middle class, who really runs the church, most of the churches, and the poor, who in many ways are not really brought into leadership, not brought into the center of the church. And so we have to bring the poor, we have to bring the disenfranchised. They have to be at the center of the church, like that imagery of Dr. King, putting them in the front, being the leaders of it. We need a reconciliation movement in the black community, not only between the black older generation and the younger generation, the black church and Black Lives Matter, but also a class reconciliation between the black middle class and the black inner city poor, where all of these things really need to come together more to work, for a better solution.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's one of the points that Marvin McMichael makes in his book, Preaching to the Black Middle Class, calling for the reconciliation of classes. I think it's interesting what you were saying about support too, because I don't want to romanticize white support for black church leaders, because I know a lot of black church leaders who will say that white support also becomes chains because they're restricted from speaking on these issues. So there's flaws on both sides. Communities, we have to, I think that the church planting movement and that whole idea is new for black churches. So leadership has to really be taught that and that role and how we're going to do that. And in a lot of cases, sometimes the new church plants aren't necessary. Sometimes revitalization and people willing to work with older pastors, I think, could be more helpful because resources are already there. Buildings are already owned. So there's a lot of ways that we have to fight to reconcile and build relationships between one another to really help on a holistic way. What do you think, for those who are listening that want to get involved, that are in St. Louis, that want to get involved, what do you think would be some good next steps?
Yeah, I think I think amen to everything you were saying, first of all, and I think kind of with that, that's why I think the first steps really are to kind of speak out and to really get involved with these organizations that are just like, some people will say, well, with the protesting, like, I want to go, but what's the point? I'm saying, well, I think that especially our young people have been so just beaten down, and that these things become the tipping point where it's kind of the last straw where people need to vent. And I think just coming alongside, like, especially believers, pastors, leaders, just believers, it doesn't, no matter what, but those of us that are in the church, especially in the black church, because I agree with everything you said. Like, I mean, there's so many, there are a lot of those black pastors that I'm talking about that are doing these church plants. A lot of them have now walked away from a lot of their white partners when kind of the curtain gets pulled back, and then they really start to see some of them strings that get attached, right? And then they're kind of like left out, like for nowhere. But I know a church that actually, I think, would embody kind of like a good model of that addresses a lot of what you're saying. Like, there's a church here that's actually really close to downtown, that actually was a young church that started, but then came into an older established black church building that was kind of fledgling and dying and was not reaching the youth. And the young and the older pastor came together and merged a new church. And they actually opened up their church building the other night, the Friday night when the protest started jumping off, and had like coming in their church. And it's like a really good model, because the older church, the black church that owned the building, they've been there for like over 100 years. And then, like you said, this was a new church. And it's actually interesting because the younger pastor I'm thinking of, was in a very, very, I'm not going to name it, but everybody would know who it is, but in a very established white national global speaker and leader. that kind of ended up leaving from that white institution, and when they realized that support of his plant was coming with a lot of desire to control that, just like what often happens when you're dealing with the dominant culture.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Something that I think, because one of the concerns I'm seeing even with church planting and the young and the old, it's like all the young people go to one church, so 18 to 35, and then all the 36 till 70, 80 go to another church. So you have strength sometimes without wisdom, then you have wisdom with no strength. And so there needs to be working together for us to have a better reach and for us to be more effective in our communities, because that split, I feel like, is as damaging as the racial split. If you just have, then you open yourself up to a lot of scandal sometimes, because there's not the wisdom coupled up with the youth. And so I think, and sometimes, I'm not saying that older people don't have scandal, because they do, but I'm just saying that sometimes the working together helps alleviate some of the things we see in our churches.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's, no, I 100% agree. And so, I think that's really why, like you were saying in terms of next step, I think that's why it's so important for those of us in the Black church, to really come out and show solidarity with these people, and protest with them. Come out, get in the protests, and let them see you lift up your hands and shout at the top of your lungs, Black Lives Matter, right? Yes, we're not going to say F the police with them. Yes, we're not going to say we need to fry pigs like bacon, but we can say Black Lives Matter, and we can say, just like people say, God bless America, right? And we don't say God only bless America. People, when you say God bless America, nobody says, well, God bless every country. Don't say all countries matter, yeah, but we're saying God bless America. So we can say Black Lives Matter, right? And so let them hear us and see us saying that, and let them see us coming to where they're at, right? I mean, Paul, when he wanted to reach the Gentiles, he didn't sit around in the synagogue waiting for them to show up, but he went out to the Areopagus and he was saying, oh, I see that you're very religious. And he was like studying and learning with them and bringing the gospel to them. So let's not only hold a church meeting or a pastor meeting or interfaith prayer meeting and expect them to come to that, because they won't. But let's go to their protest. Let's go to their meeting. Let's go to their action plan. And let's just listen. Let's just listen and participate and see how we can bring our churches alongside in ways that are faithful to the scripture and faithful to our identity as believers. And let's show them that we're here for them, right? Again, I think that there's reconciliation needed on so many different levels, but I do see in scripture that there, so there's reconciliation between rich and poor and needed. But in scripture, I see the call on the wealthy to be a little bit more than the call on the poor. There's a call on both sides, right? But with more power comes more responsibility, right? I'm quoting Spider-Man, but and that's where I do see the onus slightly more on us in the Black church, especially those of us that are older, right? To come alongside young people, young leaders, right? Because they need that guidance, and to give them platforms in our churches to really help them lead, and not just kind of a perpetual auditioning of this is the son in the ministry of the armor bearer for 10 years until I retire, but to actually give them real power in the church, to give them, co-leading power where we're working together. And then in our churches. So I think that's the two-sidedness of it, is both going into the spaces of young people, speaking their language, embracing urban hip hop culture where we can, where it's not, just anti-biblical and just irredeemable, but where it is kind of embracing, where we're able to kind of incorporate that to really, empowering local leaders. I mean, in the same way that a lot of us in the Black church, when we've seen the reality of how a lot of white institutions do, when they say they want diversity, they pay lip service to it, they might bring one of us in, then we realize that it's really kind of, sometimes we were just there for decoration, and they're not really trying to actually empower us. And then, so, we have to, as much as that's wrong, and as much as we are validly upset about when that happens, we have to also be honest about how we might be doing some of the same thing when it comes to age. And like, are we really ready to give younger leaders that are biblically qualified, biblically trained? Are we really ready to give them real controlling power and really work together, like this church that I'm talking about here, where young and old have come together and are sharing power. So I think that's if I could, boil it up, I think that the two-sided approach of my 2 cents, and based on what I'm seeing is Black church, especially because like if we were going to talk about what the white church used to do, that'd be a whole other and probably much longer conversation. Yeah, like there's a whole other. But if we're just again, and I like the fact that we really focus our conversation on how we can be building up, because we know that white supremacy is there, and we know that there's all those other kind of broader overarching issues that we're also working to change. But at least internally, how we're relating as a community, if Black church, can we go into the space of Black Lives Matter? Can we be present? Can we show them our solidarity? Can we enter into their reality and just kind of come alongside them? And then can we create churches and can we make sure that our home is more accommodating and more open, on all levels, both for someone coming in off the streets and for someone who's ready to be a leader, at every level. Can we make it open, accommodating, and be intentional about incorporating, making sure that the Black community and the streets are coming into and being nurtured by the Black church?
Mm-hmm. I think that's very, very helpful and insightful. What books would you recommend on this topic for people who want to just delve more in how they could, seek reconciliation in this area, as specifically in the Black church? I know you mentioned MLK's autobiography. Was it his biography or autobiography? Sorry.
Well, actually, either one. Like his autobiography is real. I think that's the best one because I forget the author who kind of compiled all the different firsthand writings of Dr. King and kind of put it together with the family's permission as a as an autobiography. I forget the name, but yeah, either one. But the autobiography is real powerful because when you hear it in his own words, kind of the way in which the anger of the young people, that he encountered, and the way that he felt it was moving him to really be there for them and enter into their reality, I think is real powerful. But then also, I think probably one of my favorite models for what this looks like in terms of building a church that's catering to young people is Phil Jackson in Chicago, the House Church, which is a predominantly hip hop church, mostly young adults. And he wrote a book with Ephraim Smith called The Hip Hop Church that came out a number of years ago. And that's a really good book that just kind of explains and describes what does it look like for young people. It talks about hip hop a lot, but it's really more than just the music, right? But it's the culture of urban youth and what does it look like to create a church that is like conducive and really speaks to and reflects that culture. And then of course, I think that, the new Jim Crow, a lot of people have heard of that, but I think that is a really good book for a lot of our more established pastors to read. Because I think that when I've seen this so much in the Black community that sometimes we're so much embedded in the forest that all we see is the trees and not the forest itself. And so sometimes we will just think about the problems in our community as well. Young people are shooting each other, or, dads aren't in the house, or, people are on drugs, or people need to just get it together. I'm like, yes, that's all true. But there are systems in place that are, keeping our community the way it is. And that the issues we're seeing in our community are more the reaction to those systemic injustices as opposed to the cause of them. And so and that's just looking at mass incarceration with Michelle Alexander's book. But I think that it would just be a really good book for a lot of Black pastors to read and really just to, see the systemic nature of it. Because I think when we just kind of come out of the forest and just not see the trees, but see the whole system, then it will just naturally engender more of our pastors to say, okay, yes, we need to continue to develop our people, train our people, and disciple them. But we also need to start speaking truth to power as well. And so, I think that's a good one as well. Also, another good one is by Alexia Salvatierra, Faith Rooted Organizing. I think that's also a really good book. It's a really good kind of how-to in terms of how, from a Christian perspective, how we can, enter into issues of social justice and neighborhood organizing, asset-based community development, and advocacy on behalf of the poor and the oppressed, in a way that is helpful. Another good book that was written by another St. Louis theologian. Well, she just recently moved to another seminary, but Leah Gunning Francis wrote a book called Ferguson and Faith, and that is a really good kind of vignette of the movement that happened 3 years ago, where she did on the ground research and documentation of the role of different clergy, and of course, I mean, it's again clergy from across the spectrum, but that's another good kind of vignette. But in terms of like kind of how to both on the discipling level, I would say Phil Jackson's book Hip Hop Church, and then I would say on the systemic engagement level, I would say Salvatierra, her book is on Faith Reorganizing, are real good ones.
Awesome. How can people get on social media?
Yeah, you can hit me up, Vince Bantu. I'm on Facebook, and I'm always posting stuff, so definitely hit me up there. And you can definitely see me on my church page, Outpour Covenant Church here in St. Louis, outpourstl.org. And then you can also hit me up, email there, Vince Bantu at outpourstl.org, or you can hit me up through my seminary. I'm at Covenant Theological Seminary, directing the City Ministry Initiative and teaching missiology. So you can hit me up there, vince.bantu at covenantseminary.edu. And I'd love to hear from people.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and I just want to I want to make a little praise report that because I know most of the time when I'm on here, I'm always talking about early African Christianity, and that's actually my favorite thing to talk about. And I want to give a little praise report that the complete draft of the book is done. So I'm working on revisions right now. So definitely stay tuned for that, Lord willing, the revisions will be done soon, and that'll be coming out with InterVarsity Press soon. And the introduction to early African Christianity.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again.